Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we are going to look at a lot of different types of migrations, specifically different types of voluntary migration and forced migration. This is another vocab-heavy lecture, but make sure to note the examples as well. Let's begin with voluntary migration. Voluntary migration is permanent movement undertaken by choice. When migrants make the choice to move, it's considered voluntary migration. Migration for economic reasons are generally considered voluntary. So guest workers would be an example of voluntary migrants. A guest worker is a legal immigrant who has a work visa, usually short-term. This is typically seen in the more developed countries of Northern and Western Europe, where migrants usually come from Southern and Eastern Europe or North Africa in search of higher paying jobs. As our definition states, guest workers are typically immigrants from periphery and semi-periphery countries who are pulled to core countries with stronger economies. For example, migrants from North Africa will often travel to France looking for work. These jobs typically involve manual labor, particularly in agriculture, but are also in the service sector as well. Germany, for example, brought in many Turkish workers after World War II. While many workers completed their contracts and returned to Turkey, millions stayed in Germany. Presently, Turkish is the largest ethnic minority in Germany. But other countries have utilized guest worker programs. Japan and the United States have utilized guest workers to meet demand for workers. Countries in the Persian Gulf, like Oman and the United Arab Emirates, have recruited guest workers from South Asian countries like India and Bangladesh throughout the 1990s and 2000s. These guest workers will often send much of their pay back to their home country. These payments are known as remittances, which we define as money migrants send back to family and friends in their home countries, often in cash, forming an important part of the economy in many developing countries. Remittances can account for significant amounts of the income of small countries, like the Central Asian countries of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan. But perhaps one of the best examples of voluntary migration in U.S. history is the Great Migration. Beginning in 1916, over 80% of African Americans lived in the American South. The Great Migration occurred as over 6 million African Americans left the South for the industrialized cities of the Northeast, Midwest, and later the West. They were pushed from the South by discrimination, violence, and a pest called the boll weevil that severely damaged the cotton crop. As a result, economic pull factors like jobs in mills and factories that paid nearly 3 times more than African Americans were earning in the rural South enticed people to move. By 1970, roughly half of the African American population was living outside of the South. Now we're going to dig into the different types of voluntary migration. Geographers tend to categorize migration based on characteristics like scale, from local to global, time, whether migration is temporary or permanent, and distance traveled, if migration is a long distance or a short distance. Internal migration is a permanent movement within a particular country. Internal migration is sometimes called interregional migration because it happens between regions within a country. So the Great Migration was an example of an internal migration. International migration, sometimes called transnational migration, is permanent movement from one country to another. International migration sits at an all-time high, with nearly 250 million people currently living outside of the country they were born in. But that still only represents about 3% of the global population. As Ravenstein mentioned in his laws, most migrations will be internal due to the friction of distance. Ravenstein also noticed that most migration is from rural to urban, and that if a migrant were to go a long distance, like international migration, they'll settle in a big city. This process of rural to urban migration is known as urbanization, which is the movement of people to and the clustering of people in towns and cities. But it is net migration from a rural area to the urban city area. In 1950, about 1/3 of the world's people lived in cities. By 2007, the number had shifted to over 50% and currently sits at 55%, and is projected to reach 68% of the world's population living in cities by 2050. As primary sector work declines, workers move to cities for employment in the secondary and tertiary sectors, which cities tend to have a higher concentration of those types of jobs. Migrants may gain greater access to education and healthcare, and gender equality tends to be higher in urban areas. All of these elements have contributed to people voluntarily choosing to move to cities, despite the challenges that exist like higher crime, poverty, and air pollution. But because of these challenges, we're seeing migrants settle in both urban and suburban areas right now. Our next type of voluntary migration again follows Ravenstein's laws, as he predicted that migration would proceed in stages, known as step migration, which is migration to a distant destination that occurs in stages. For example, from a farm to a nearby village and later to a town and city. So migrants that are attempting to migrate to Europe may move through Libya, Tunisia, and Morocco on their way to Spain before ultimately ending up in Germany. That's an example of step migration. They may actually end up living in each of these countries for a while they save money to make that next move. And these steps can help reduce the risk associated with each of these migrations. Our example of the Great Migration actually saw lots of step migration. For example, a farming family from the South may move to Nashville, then Louisville, then Indianapolis, on their way to their ultimate destination of Detroit. The Great Migration also saw lots of chain migration. Chain migration is migration of people to a specific location because relatives, friends, or members of the same nationality previously migrated there. So when a migrant moves, often from a rural area to an urban area, or makes an international move, they'll write home or call home and communicate with family members and friends. That creates a positive perception of the area they just moved to. This creates a chain reaction, pulling family and friends to that specific area. So when African Americans moved to northern cities in the Great Migration, they wrote or called home, causing many friends and family to migrate to that same spot. Chain migration also pulls people to a specific part of a city, often clustering near people who speak the same language or practice the same religion. This creates ethnic enclaves within cities. So when Italian immigrants settled in New York, Philadelphia, or Chicago, other Italians were pulled to those same cities and those same neighborhoods, creating ethnic enclaves that are often called Little Italy. Our last type of voluntary migration is found in rural areas, dominated by the primary sector. Transhumance is the seasonal, periodic movement of pastoralists and their livestock between highland and lowland pastures. Essentially, nomadic herders will move their herds between cooler, higher elevation grazing lands in the summer to lower elevation pastures in the winter. In the Horn of Africa, hundreds of thousands of nomadic herders and their livestock follow seasonal rainfall to new grazing grounds. But this movement is not permanent, but rather cyclical with the seasons. But not everyone who leaves their home does so by choice. We need to examine involuntary migration, which we call forced migrations, which are permanent migration flows in which the movers have no choice but to relocate, usually compelled by cultural factors. Forced migrants are compelled to move by extreme push factors, war, political upheaval, or natural disasters. Migrants who are fleeing persecution based on their ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs are also considered forced migrants. The largest forced migration in human history was the transatlantic slave trade. Between 10 to 12 million men, women, and children were taken from their homes in West Africa and taken to the Americas. Notice on our flow vector map, a type of proportional symbol map, that the largest number of enslaved Africans were taken to the Caribbean, followed by Brazil, and then to North America. A form of modern-day slavery is also known as human trafficking, when people are abducted from their homes and transported away or forced to work. This can be forced labor, involuntary servitude, sex trafficking, or the recruitment of child soldiers. Another historical example of forced migration was the Trail of Tears. Between 1825 and 1840, the U.S. government took lands from 5 Native American tribes. Then, approximately 100,000 people from the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole tribes were forcibly relocated to what was then known as Indian Territory in modern-day Oklahoma. But at times, it can be difficult to distinguish between voluntary and forced migration. For example, the mass emigration of Irish from Europe to North America in the 1800s, was that forced or voluntary? There were certainly extreme push factors like the Irish potato famine, along with laws that prohibited Catholics, predominantly from Ireland, from owning land or voting, that would suggest this was a forced migration. But if those displaced Irish chose North America, and specific cities within North America, like Boston, where chain migration drew many people, would that be voluntary? Certain circumstances blur the lines between voluntary and forced migration. But at the end of the day, voluntary migrants have an option of where and when to go and what to do once they are there. Forced migrants do not. Continuing our conversation about migrants who have no choice to leave, we need to talk about people who flee their homes to save their lives or preserve their freedoms. Refugees are people who are forced to migrate from their home country and cannot return due to a well-founded fear of persecution because of their race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. Refugees will often leave with only the possessions they can carry and travel by any means necessary. The journey to escape their extreme push factors can often be quite dangerous, even deadly. And if they arrive at a refugee camp to receive protection, the conditions can still be very difficult. There are a few important characteristics that are important to note. Fear of persecution does not include economic persecution. Our definition includes cultural, social, and political factors, and we could even extend that definition to include environmental factors like natural disasters or climate change that force people to fear for their lives. But economics are not considered a reason for someone to flee their home as a refugee. Next, for someone to be considered a refugee, they must have crossed an international boundary and to have been granted asylum or protection by a foreign government. But people may flee from their home, but not their home country. If someone fears for their life or freedom, but has moved internally, they are considered an internally displaced person, or IDP. These are migrants who have been forced to migrate for similar political reasons as a refugee, but has not migrated across an international border. The stories of IDPs do not often receive the same attention as those of refugees, despite IDPs significantly outnumbering the number of refugees worldwide. And this is troubling because IDPs remain under the laws and therefore the protection of their own government, even if that government is unwilling or unable to provide protection. And while refugees can seek asylum or protection in any of the 145 countries that have ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention, that process can take some time. While they await refugee status, they are considered an asylum seeker, or someone who has migrated to another country in the hope of being recognized as a refugee. By gaining refugee status, the host country is expected to provide civil rights, the right to work, and social services, which can be huge for people who only have the clothes on their backs. So to provide some significance to these different definitions, let's get some statistics. In 2022, there are over 89 million people, more than 1% of the global population, forcibly displaced from their homes, with some sources citing more than 100 million due to the war in Ukraine. 53 million were internally displaced persons. 21 million were in another country and had gained refugee status, and another 4.6 million were seeking asylum. So what conflicts are causing these huge numbers of people to flee their homes, fearing for their lives? The Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, has generated over 25% of all refugees at present, as half the population of the country has fled, leading to 6 million refugees and another 6 million people internally displaced. Sudan and South Sudan are embroiled in conflict, as Sudan has engaged in a genocidal war in the Darfur region, and South Sudan has alternated between conflict, famine, and food insecurity. The Rohingya in Myanmar, a Muslim minority in a majority Buddhist country, have seen more than half their population cross the border into neighboring Bangladesh. And Venezuela is generating a huge number of internally displaced persons, while also gaining special designation by the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, or UNHCR, the organization that assists refugees. In addition, the UNHCR recognizes almost 6 million Palestinians as having been displaced, but without including them in the refugee, IDP, or asylum seeker numbers that we listed previously. So that will conclude our lecture for tonight. We'll examine this in much more detail when we come back to class. Have a good evening, everyone.